Good morning.
Morning. Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Happy Hump Day.
Oh, Reed's favorite term.
The day for humping. And for camel humps.
It does make sense, right? That if there is a hump day and you just needed to have sex once a week. I like the idea.
I like that Freudian slip there.
Yeah. You just need to.
Well, that's why they have day in the name of the week, right? Because that's how often you're supposed to have sex.
Is that what
this
it is?
day, that day, next day,
Yeah.
every day.
Yeah, and each one has a little flavor, and Wednesday is hump day. Yeah.
Just a little food for thought for everyone out there. I mean, camels some of them have one humps. Some of them have two humps.
Ooh.
Up to you what you want to do with that.
Just saying. Some of them are much more frisky than others.
Yeah. You know, what you going to do with all those humps?
Those lumps.
Those lovely camel humps. Good morning, everybody. It is November. Nope, it's not. Today is December.
What?
Oh, wait. Oh, this is... I have the power.
Applause. Come on.
DJ Horn, let's
Yes.
go. It is now December 2021, which for some people, it's like, yay, this year's ending. For other people, it's like, no, this year's ending. For some people, it's like, yay, the holidays are coming. But wait, we've had Christmas lights up now for a month and a half. I don't understand.
Yeah, Christmas starts right after July 4th, right?
It seems because America. I just watched a video, if not yesterday, the day before, where a guy was hand painting his Christmas lights because he didn't like the way the colors came in the manufacturer. I'm like, respect, just not me at all. Not me at all.
I don't know. That's a waste. I'm just kind of, you're wasting your time, buddy.
But they're so pretty.
Yeah, if you
get the colors
if you're
you
looking
want.
for something to do, I've got chores at my house. Come on over.
Well, for those of you at home who heard that and was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." Well, he was trying a whole bunch of different methods, and the one he found out that worked best was nail polish. And I was like, "Oh, he tried all these different types of paints and things like that, and actually nail polish worked out really well. It's like comes with its own applicator, goes on thick and smooth." And I was like, okay, if I ever decide that I want to buy a string of white lights and color each one of them, now I know how I'm going to do that.
Oh.
Or more importantly, how I'm going to tell somebody to do that so I don't have to do
so
it.
you don't do. Yeah, I went to visit my dad during Thanksgiving, and he's in a new house, and they decided they were going to paint the outdoor balcony area. They just painted straight over the fluorescent lights.
Oh,
so they're all now
nice.
Frosted white, but it's not really frosting. They're just painted.
Yeah. It's funny how painters tend to cut corners all the time, right? It's like my parents they went from a regular AC control unit to one of the smart ones, Nest or whatever, one of those things, and then it's like, huh. I forgot our walls were that color because underneath the faceplate, they didn't.
You take it off and it's that just, ugly beige or something. Yeah,
and it's like, of course, right after you get your painting done is when you realize all those little small things on the wall that you need to take off. So if you're at home and you're ever doing a paint job, take off all of your light switch covers, your air conditioner control. If you've got a pool, that was the other one. My parents got new pool controls, first time in 25 years or whatever. And now there's the big, lovely patch behind it. So yeah, always take off all your plates. But yeah, when it comes to holiday decorations, where do you fall on the spectrum? I mean, you love them, you love putting them up, or you just absolutely hate them, or you just kind of don't really care.
So, not to go too far into it, but I have a history of men falling off of roofs in my family.
So are you Kris Kringle?
Once the beard really goes full white, we will find out.
I mean, I
will get the magical Santa powers.
I mean, I saw Tim Allen. I mean, he started to put on that gut. It's just
happening.
like it's that time of year. I mean, you've been eating a lot of desserts lately.
That's all I eat, really. Wow, that's funny. Come to think of it, I'm warming up for the new role.
Really, falling off roofs, huh? So you've avoided the lights.
I avoid the whole thing.
That's a good, honestly, as far as excuses go, that's pretty much one of the best ones I've heard. Right?
Oh, well, thanks.
Yeah. So good job.
It's really because I don't want to do it, but overall, I'm gonna blame it on fate or destiny or superstition.
Well, if there's one thing I know about science and statistics is that something happened in the past, it's going to happen again. And, just because something happened to other people means it's going to happen to you.
Just ask the dinosaurs.
I say it, just like that because we have a special guest who happens to be in the green room and I can feel her rolling around in her grave. So we'll talk to her a little bit later. But yeah, so yesterday, I gotta admit, I'm a little thrown off because yesterday you and I actually did our first pre-recorded segment that we're going to show either sometime later this week, maybe sometime next week. This is where Reed doesn't commit to anything because there's work required between now and then. So,
it'll never happen. We'll have this one episode in the can just in case.
And this is the type of case where it's like, oh, you want to post that pre-recorded video? I'm going to go put up Christmas lights now. I'm going to paint every single one.
Right. You've got one job, Reed. What are you going to do? Not that.
Not that. Yeah. And that's called productive procrastination, people. I'm very good at that one.
Yeah. No, let's see. Last in the morning, we discussed the hero tendency.
Yes.
And willpower.
Of course, you remember that one. We were talking about you and your podcast.
I got to feel so good about myself that episode. It was wonderful. It was the best day ever.
It's like, mark the gold star on my calendar for that day.
Oh, that felt so nice.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the hero tendency, which after acknowledging it was probably horrible for SEO terms, give us a little quick summary again.
Yeah, just the idea of becoming more overcoming and just the idea of humans wanting to do that for themselves and getting into self-optimization and productivity hacks and all these kind of things, but also sort of looking at fiction and the idea of the blank slate, the idea that you could shape yourself or become a hired assassin and get training. And so I was looking at fiction a lot and just sort of comparing it to how our goals are shaped today. And then I sort of brought up sort of the template for the superhero, which was from Nietzsche and the Übermensch. and sort of discussed how actually the Ubermensch isn't supposed to be a superhero so much as the Beyond Man who is overcoming binaries. So overcoming things like the consciousness and the subconscious, trying to meld those two together. So really doing a lot of interior journeying and instead of so much exterior. Even though of course exterior and interior get paired up pretty well and they can supplement each other. So yeah, we were talking about some of that, and yeah, we're kind of going down rabbit holes about willpower and who you are all the time. You might not even know who you are from moment to moment. And that's coming from Daniel Kahneman's book Noise.
Yeah, and it was really interesting when you brought that up because you were saying how, even though you are if you're given the same situation, on a different day, maybe it's presented a little bit differently, but it's still the same situation, you will actually make a different choice, in one of the at those different times, because one of the things we referenced too is the judges who,
Yes.
based on the time of day, how hungry they are, all of these other factors, it's like, wow, look at how much that influences their decision, because it's very easy for us to, think we're rational. We have all this control. We know all these things and, we're going to do the best, I had a conversation last week with somebody and I was talking with them and I was like, we were talking about something kind of statistical in the past, like, I'm like, hey, like that just happened to you because of percentages and stats, and a very smart person, and it's like, and there's this bias and this bias which makes you focus more attention to these things, and it's like, he's like, I know all these things, but I still have this data set. I'm like, yeah, but your data set is flawed, and I'm like, if you were not you listening to yourself, you would be skeptical too.
Yeah, right.
And then I ended the conversation by saying, like, look, man, like, you very well could be right, but I just want to make sure you're aware, like, if you heard yourself, like, you would be skeptical of yourself. So, which is good to have, right? That's why, it's good to have that third party who's, not biased, and can help you with some of those types of things, right? Especially if you're dealing with more difficult decisions than the silly thing that we were talking about.
Yeah, no, the skepticism is great. And then, but there's also areas and times to be skeptical. And there's other times where it's just like, no, this is going to be a great Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's not be skeptical about that.
Well, statistics show that is true for me.
Statistics show.
I've had very many good, at least, really, I've been very blessed with all of the great Thanksgivings I've had, but especially in the food department. That's one thing about being around a family that cooks all the time. Oh man, that makes Thanksgiving that much better, because I know there's a lot of people who kind of just tolerate Thanksgiving or grit their teeth through Thanksgiving, and then they have to eat bad food too. And I'm like, I'm so sorry. At the very least, if you have good food, you have something you can like look forward to.
Yeah, I don't. I'm just a leech when it comes to Thanksgiving. I just show up and I just consume whatever is there.
Oh, I just thought you just walked around like sucking people's blood. I was like,
well, there's a little bit of that. If there's
not again, get off, Ryder.
It's because we drink a lot at the house, and if we run out of booze, then
okay. So what I'm hearing is you drink a lot, you
find
drink
Uncle
the bloods
Larry.
of your relatives. You wonder why people are falling off roofs. They're like, get me out of here.
Hey, let's go put up the Christmas lights. Yeah.
Well, today like I mentioned a little bit, we have a special guest. Some of y'all might recognize her. This is her third appearance, I believe. Her name is Alexandra Mannering. And we're going to get to her in a little bit, but she is one of our data analyst specialists and looking at statistics and numbers and things like that. And, of course, she's really smart. She can do them all in the really fancy, sciencey type of things, but we help her tell us, like, hey, tell us lay people, like, how do we apply, the maths and stuff that we never were told we were never going to use in our lives? How do we use that, So she's going to talk with us a little bit today. And it's a really interesting topic today. We're going to talk about interpreting science in the news.
Stats.
Stats. Yeah, and the power of them. You can say whatever you want. And I can't have another stats episode without saying that 60% of the time, this is a useful conversation. Every time. Every time. And so we're going to talk with her. That's not how it works. And then after that, we're going to talk about, we've talked a handful of times about kind of overconsumption, and last week I think it was, or maybe earlier this week, we talked about turning off autoplay on your Netflix and maybe changing how you hang out with your family if you find that the only way you're hanging out is watching TV or a movie or just consuming something. But we recognize consumption is a good thing too, and so we want to talk about how maybe instead of just reducing, which we still think you should do probably on the average, is change your consumption and what exactly you are consuming and how that can affect what you think about, how you feel, a whole bunch of stuff. So we're going to get into that after we talk with our lovely guest. But before all of that, I just say that we talk about something really important that is helpful for life. Welcome to What the Hell is Water. I'm Reed Garcia.
And this is Ryder Richards.
And I forgot to say our title again. Let's try that again.
I am the co-host. I'm going to just cut in, throw that out there real quick. Just in case.
I'm Ryder Garcia.
The founder and
The founder and that guy.
Co-CEO.
The couch man.
The couch man.
The couch man. So without further ado, welcome back, everybody. It is December 1st, 2021, and I think it is time that we go say hello to our guest, Alexandra.
Dum, 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 dum.
Alexandra, good morning. Well, say something for me, Alexandra. Oh, there you go. It took a second for the mic to kick in, but now we can hear you. You look amazing. Did you have an amazing vacation?
Right. We had a wonderful time. Finally got to see family for we haven't seen for 2 years. So.
Oh, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that. Oh, and you were traveling. Feel free to not say if you don't want to, but were you somewhere in the U.S. or did you go elsewhere?
No, I was in the UK.
UK, wow.
Yeah.
I was just trying to give an intentionally broad thing to help protect your privacy and all that kind of stuff, but it's no, of course I was over across the pond.
UK.
Yes. Did you have a hot cuppa while you were over there?
Of course. You have to drink thousands of cups of tea if you're in England.
Nice. I like it. That is one place I still haven't been yet. I'm itching to go. It's on, I don't really have a bucket list, but it's on there anyways, is going to a football match and then watching, this one honestly might be more important, watching a football match, meaning soccer for you Americans, silly Americans, watching a soccer game in a pub, especially in a place where they're really proud and they're oh, my team, your team, sports.
Yeah, you want to put yourself in the middle of that.
Yeah.
Depending on what kind of experience you want, you may also want to consider watching rugby instead.
Oh yeah. Well, why do you say that?
Well, so they joke that rugby is a ruffian's game played by gentlemen, and football is a gentleman's game played by ruffians. Oh. So if you go to a football game, depending which football game you go to, expect drunken rowdiness escalated times 10. And sort of same with the pub. It's very much a drinking sport that happens to involve some balls that you kick around.
Balls getting kicked around.
Right? I had to build off your theme from earlier. I've been sitting in the room for a while.
Nice. Oh, okay. So I have to ask. Everything I said earlier was completely accurate, right? About statistics and history repeating itself. Perfect. You guys heard it here first. Thank you, Alexandra. Have a nice day.
I was taking notes.
Oh no.
Reed was right. Reed was right again.
Yes.
Oh man.
It almost felt like one of those punishments on the chalkboard where you just write the same thing over and over.
Actually, that's why we bring you on the show, Alexandra, to tell us how right we are.
How right everyone is. That's always been my role, always in life. I just tell people how right they are. I never disagree with people.
Yeah, I was thinking about that the other day as this is going to come as a surprise to some people, but I don't mind disagreeing with people, and I was I say that in a weird way, but I think it's a good trait to have, and doing it in a respectful way, of course, that's a big caveat. But there's a lot of people who, and I don't blame anyone, right? Who they'll just go along with whatever, right? And I think it's good, and especially in a group dynamic, you got to have some people.
Yeah,
that,
you got to have a co-host who will just nod along with you.
Exactly.
I think it's important.
What was that you were saying a second ago?
Oh, whatever you said, Reed.
Reed is right. Reed is right.
Reed is right.
Good.
Yeah.
Good writer. Oh man. Well, so yeah, I guess what were your notes there, Alexandra?
Oh no, so it feeds in perfectly to discussing about what we read about science in the news, because that study on judges has actually been has failed to be replicated. Let's just say that.
Ah, see,
Because
I'm glad we
I
got
did the
you
same
on.
thing. I cited that. I was talking to my dad, who's a psychologist, and he was like, "Yeah, we were unable to replicate that." And this is actually a problem that's showing up in a bunch of different sciences. Psychology, especially, has been hit the worst about this idea of the replication crisis. And it feeds into the fact that when you do a study, right, you have to say, does my evidence actually show that this pattern is real beyond just random chance? And this is a part around science that is really hard even for scientists to keep in their heads, that when you do something, you can get patterns that show up just by chance. I mean, how many people have seen like Jesus in a piece of toast? Or like you get things that show up that look meaningful, but it actually is just random. And so there's certainly like statistical things, those maths, right, that we don't like to talk about, that you can use to help you know, like, is this evidence strong enough that we think this is a real pattern and not just chance? But even those tests are still subject to chance, just at a smaller level. And so that's why repeating a finding is really important, because if you get it once by chance and you've made it really hard to get it by chance and you get it again, then you can be pretty sure, like, yes, this thing is a real pattern we're finding rather than it just randomly popping up. But if you get it once and then you don't get it again, it means that probably that first time was more likely chance than not. And so psychology is full of this. Like, you read all these papers of these really cool findings, and they actually haven't been able to be replicated. So there's a chance that the original finding was just random chance, not actually showing a real underlying pattern.
Yeah, well, real quick, I just want to point out, here in America, we just call it math. You know, I know in the UK you call it maths, but, you know, just come on.
I
Yeah,
know.
because there's so many of them. In America, we could only handle one math.
Arithmetic,
Yeah.
simple arithmetic. But no, that's very good points, and you know, it's worth pointing out. I'm an electrical engineer. I'm a very smart guy. You know,
This really is the Reed show.
right? It
today.
really is
Yeah.
the Reed show. But even I, you know, I struggle a lot with trying to find this. You find good data, and it's really tough, especially now, because it's there's even like journals out there, scientific journals and things like that, or at least they call themselves scientific journals, but they're like, hey, if you pay us money, you can get published in
Right.
us, and they have these like fancy sounding names and things like that. So if you don't really dig in, then you will not find like, oh, this is, you know, this isn't really a thing, and it sounds all official, and it has citations elsewhere because other people have made that same mistake. And one thing I want to point out is that scientists are people too. You know, even though scientists are smart and they are trained and they're aware of these things, just like in the little, you know, tidbit story I was telling earlier, you know, that is a very technical person. They had training in this type of thing. It's like it's easy to fall for these biases, even when you're aware of them, just because that's the nature of how they work, right? I mean, you can't get past them. But I guess my main question for you, Alexandra, is like, you know, it's very easy to go into the mindset like, hey, I trusted science once and it's failed me, so I'm never going to trust it again, right? And then that's not even getting into the institutional things that you can see like with race and stuff like that, where it's like, well, these people have a history of not, you know, it makes sense for them not to trust the man or the science or people who are telling them what's good for them. So like, how can you blame them for, you know, for not trusting it? So I guess, what do you say to someone who says like, hey, you know, science, you know, failed me once or twice and now I'm never going to trust it again?
I mean, I think it's a Winston Churchill quote where he says, democracy is the worst form of government except everything else we've tried.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, you bring up a really good point that science is carried out by humans. And so we are fallible beings. We make mistakes. And so those mistakes are going to happen. And what I feel about the scientific method, right, this approach of how we try to answer questions in a scientific mindset, it is flawed when carried out by flawed things, but it's better than everything else we've got out there. So like, yes, it may have failed you, but how many times have other things that you're relying on failed you? And I think what you'll find is that science self-corrects a lot better than everything else out there. So everything is prone to mistakes. Every way that we think about trying to decide about things, if you look at like during the rational movement, you know, they said, well, we should just be able to reason our way through things. And that was full of mistakes too, because it's based, you have to have this starting assumption. And if you just base that on your experience or what you like logically think, there are flaws in that too, because it's limited by your experience and your knowledge. And so if you sort of start with saying, what are all the ways I can make a decision, all the ways I can understand something, how accurate are those? How well have all of those served me? And then you find that like science does the best job of finding those mistakes when they happen and fixing them. And it is, you bring up a really great point of, how do you judge evidence? And I've been struck by this of, why do I think the things that I think? Why do I trust the things that I trust? And even as a scientist, as the data geek that I am, a large part I do find sources that I trust, and I trust that other scientists are doing work, and I look at when they come together in a large enough bulk saying something. Right. And this goes back to that sometimes like one thing will be wrong, but if you've got a crowd of scientists that are all discussing it and they all kind of come to the same conclusion, they're more likely to be more accurate. I'm not going to say right. They're just less wrong
sort of wisdom
than,
of
than
crowds
single
kind
site.
of thing.
It is. It's very, very much that. And that's why what another thing that's so cool about science is done right. It's a collective effort. It's never just one person coming up with something. It's maybe one person suggesting something or finding a study to start with. And then someone else tries it and says, oh, yeah, I got the same thing. And then someone else tries it and says, well, I was close, but actually we need to refine it a little bit. And you get just this building and refinement and editing. And that's why, again, science does a much better job self-correcting and getting closer and closer to that sort of, truth or reality than a lot of other methods of trying to figure something out.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out that, of course, we're always going to have our failures, our follies, in whatever we do as humans, right? Especially writer. But, we're better at science now than we've ever been, and we learn more and more and we know more and more. And it's great to have all this progression in the field of psychology, especially because psychology influences everything, because it's dealing with the mind and what humans do and why and all of the biases that come up. And it's worth pointing out that one of the ways of collecting data is from people. And it's like, well, people, if you're given surveys and things like that, you got to be really careful about how you write those surveys, and then knowing what people are likely to lie about and things like that. For example, probably one of the most lied about things that I can think of is, hey, when you go to the doctor and they ask you, hey, how many drinks do you have in a week? and then on top of that, sometimes they, it's like sometimes it's like laughably low too. It's like, oh, 1, 2, 3, or 10 plus, or 5 plus. It's like, if you're gonna give me those options, you know what I mean?
You do like the survey thing that it's the 4 dots, and then the fourth one is something like over 3 but under 20,
right?
And you're just like, I need a 5th bubble,
right? But another thing I wanted to point out was, the nice thing about today is that we're more globally connected than we have been in a really long time, because another problem that can happen is, this was a statistically significant, study that was done in the U.S., but hey, we've got friends over in Russia or Australia or these areas where it's like, that just doesn't apply for this population, right? And so that's another thing too, is like, okay, those things apply for this population because these people have been bred this way, or they've been, mind trained over years and decades to be that way because of their culture, things like that. So it gets into a lot of things really, really interesting to me, really fast. But I think the most important thing for you guys at home to also know is, science, engineering, you're never working with the complete data. You never have everything, right? When you are making a judgment, you're doing the best you can with what you got. And that's the same with business too, right? It's like, I don't know what's going to happen. I have this information that I have gathered and collected, and some people can do a better or worse job of collecting that data. But then there's some stuff that is just like unknowable because it hasn't happened yet, or it's not easily found or whatnot. And then there's some stuff that is maybe it's able to be found, but it's really difficult or convoluted. And then also, guess what? When it comes to people, things get complicated really fast, because one of the things that you want to try and do is isolate variables, right? So you want to say, hey, for example, one of the hardest things probably to track is diet. And it's like, hey, all right, we want to see what effect does eating red meat have on your health? Well, guess what? When you're dealing with populations of people, it's like, well, that red meat could be all sorts of different things. It could be from different manufacturers. It could be, oh, by the way, some of this is, this thing and that thing. It gets really messy really fast.
Yeah, there's a book out about, I think it's based in China. It's about people not eating red meat, and the cancer incidence being so low, I think, in China, and they're mostly using rural populations, and so that's how they sort of divide up who eats red meat and who doesn't, and all these kind of things. And I I didn't make it all the way through the book, but it was kind of interesting because the argument overall is just like cancer is caused by red meat. Stay vegan, you'll be fine. And and a lot of these studies come out, and I'm just like, well, I don't know. There's also some alternative examples. People that eat red meat and don't get cancer. So what do you do about that? So it doesn't do it all the time, but in some instances it does. So Alexandra, do you want to chime in on this?
The diet is an incredibly complicated topic to study because you're dealing with the fact like maybe China could, but the rest of us who follow a little bit more human rights, you're not allowed to just like put people in boxes and be like, I'm going to control everything about your life. And so all of these
which inherently actually affects them, right? Too. It's like, oh, okay, is that linked to the meat or
right.
the fact that they're living in this controlled box? Yeah,
yeah.
So I mean, there's a physics joke about asking a physicist like how to grow healthier cows, and he like comes back with this formula. He's like, but it only works for spherical cows in a vacuum. Like if you strip it down, you can like simplify it. But it's also true that we do what's called extrapolate, right? We take a finding in a very particular environment and then try to apply it to real life. And sometimes that works, and sometimes the most important piece of information is lost in translation as you try to do that, because there are all these other factors like genetics play a huge role in the impact of diet on people. And that's been a role that we have not been able to look at very well until very, very recently. And even still, like, yes, we can sequence your genome, but it's kind of like we can transliterate it, right? We can write out the letters that make up your genome, but we don't know how to read it. We don't know what those genes actually mean. And so without that information and without being able to control all the other factors in people's life, like how tied are you into your community? We know like there's very good evidence that having strong community bonds really promotes health. So if you're trying to compare someone who eats red meat and has really strong community bonds with some, a vegan who like lives by herself in some apartment, it's very difficult to control for the community variables to try to get back to, well, was it the eating of meat or not eating of meat that contributed to an occurrence of cancer? So most diet requirement or like regulations or recommendations, that's the word I was looking for. Most diet recommendations, I sort of feel like are guesses at the best. And if you look at them over time, they change based on sort of whatever's in vogue or like whatever sort of newest piece of research is. And they constantly flip back and forth just because it's so hard to untangle that.
For sure.
But,
Yeah,
Yeah, I think red wine and chocolate seem to be the ones that everyone should be consuming all the time.
And those are the ones where it's like studies keep going back and forth, back and forth. And it's worth pointing out as well, whether it comes to food or whatever, one of the main things that you can do is follow the money, right? And you see, all right, who funded this research? And a lot of times it's like, oh, okay, this was funded by, the Dairy Collective for the unification of America.
Right,
and you're like, oh, that's so nice and so sweet. And then you're like, wait, what is that foundation?
The food pyramid?
Yeah, right.
Like that was actually funded by like the Dairy and Meat Association or something, and so they've had to redo that. Yeah.
So you bring up an interesting point, which is you always want to understand, is there motivation potentially to make the findings falsified, right? Like, because you're saying, basically you're implying that if you're paid to find a certain thing, you'll end up finding that thing. And like, to some extent that does happen. Like you can definitely find evidence, when the tobacco companies were funding research to try to show that tobacco didn't cause cancer, didn't increase risks of cancer. But on the other hand, sometimes industry is the only one who's willing to fund some of this.
Amen.
Work. And they do very good work. Like basically, and what you have to look for is there a separation between the funding and the people doing the work, and that the people funding it have no control over how the study is developed. And as long as there's that separation, you can still get very good industry funded research, because the industry does, unless you feel that all business is evil, oftentimes a particular industry will want to understand, well, like, is this food healthy? Or is this food helpful for blank, right? You want to be able to put a statement that says this food promotes a healthy diet or a healthy heart or whatever. You have to be able to show evidence to the FDA that really supports that claim. And so a lot of times industry is willing to fund that research to try to get at it. And so you can still get good industry funded research. But
Yeah, no, I
It can be
appreciate you pointing that out because, one thing we definitely don't want people to do is be like, that was funded by them, doesn't count at all, right?
Exactly.
It's like, no, it's just like anything. It's like, hey, this is a piece of information. All right, now I know these other things
Yeah.
that help me judge that information, right? Just like when Ryder tells me something, I'm like, okay, Ryder told me that, but then,
Let's
but then when I hear it
automatically
from
discount it.
Alexandra, I'm like,
Yeah.
Alexandra, yeah,
Yeah, that's
And
actually
the other
true.
thing that I'll point out is I have run into issues with supposedly non-industry groups, but that still have an agenda, right?
Yes, good
So,
point.
in my PhD research, I ran into people telling me like, well, you can't make any kind of claim that the bat species that we were studying isn't endangered or threatened by hunting. I was like, but my evidence doesn't support that. My evidence does not support that there's this critical risk of hunting on this population. And it was like, well, but we're a conservation group. So you
Yeah.
have to support that idea that species need to be conserved. And it was just interesting that here's this supposed non-governmental, non-industry group that's like, this is who we want supposedly funding research, and yet they had their own pet biases as well.
Well, yeah, I would
So
imagine it might even be stronger in a certain, like, if this is your free time or you've given up your life to pursue this mission and and then you're doing research, it might
Yeah.
actually be even stronger. Which is interesting to think about because at that point
Yeah.
it's almost like a religious fervor or righteousness behind the mission. And
Yeah.
I don't know, the idea would be with a corporate industry that there's sort of that hopefully you could strip some of that out, and it's just a job. I
Right.
don't
Yeah.
know if this
you
is
don't quite so passionately believe about it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, so okay, I'm sitting here thinking, so I have to ask Alexandra. So you do research, you've done research with bats. You want to make
Yeah.
the world a better place. Have you spent a lot of time in underground caves with expensive
Caves, right?
billionaires?
with my fabulous technology. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
If only.
Do you know a guy named Bruce Wayne?
Bruce. There's a mansion, and
Yeah, right. Definitely don't live in a mansion. I must have lost the key to that one.
Oh,
oh,
well, we could help you find that, We'll,
yeah.
well, for a percentage. I want this percent of the house. So, okay, so I guess last thing before you go is, okay, well, if I'm a person and I hear, oh, the new survey says, or a study shows this, if I see one of these headlines, like, what do I do? Like, how I'm just a regular old Joe or Jane.
Yeah.
Like, what do I do how do I know if it's true or not?
That's a great question. And frankly, I feel like the state of science journalism today is in a bit of dire need of improvement. I'm not very impressed with a lot of the science journalism that goes on because it mostly tends towards sensationalism. So I always just view every headline that says new study shows, whatever comes next, I'm like, yeah, probably not. but if we're gonna give like a little credence to that coming out, the first thing that I will do is like, where did it come from? Did it come out of a university, with a really established research program? Or is this, some random group that just put together a survey of 100 people? So that's the first thing. I also look at like, what's the evidence? If it's survey based, I doubt it more than I'm going to doubt something that's like a clinical trial. But then also what I try to look at is how have they reported on it? So did they say new study shows red wine causes cancer? And if I see the word cause, I pretty much disregard everything else that comes, because no scientist would have said that. So whatever that journalist is reporting on, they've skewed the actual science that's underneath it. If they say new study shows that people who eat red meat are 10 times more likely to have X thing happen, that's more likely what actually the study said, is that we found these two things that coexisted. We're not sure which drives what.
So I want to emphasize that real quick because this is a case where words really do matter, and I saw this a lot when I was researching for Kickstart Your Kitchen. We were talking about doing food research and trying to figure out, is this healthy or is this healthy, and even things like, oh, is this cooked the right way? Is this food safe? All those types of things, and you see, you can follow the same study across all of these different news outlets, and they can be big name news outlets like the New York Times and all these ones are like, oh, these are respected places. But if you look at the exact wording they say and then you go back to the original study and see what they say, you'll be surprised how often it's like they cherry pick this thing out or they skew it just a little bit. And so it can get real hairy real fast. So I guess would it be safe to say that like the stronger the language is, the more you should, have your spidey senses on you and be more aware?
Yes, 100%. So the more that the article is trying to claim is proved by this thing, the less you should believe that that's actually the case. So if it's like, this new study suggests, that's pretty good. New study proves, not good. Because you can't actually prove anything in science anyway. We strongly suggest things. You can disprove stuff, but it's very difficult to prove something. So yes, stronger the language, definitely. And oftentimes it's helpful to just like use an article to pique your interest in something and then find the original press release from whatever agency released that information and go read that instead. Right? Like rather than relying on a journalist to interpret this when they have like 15 minutes to write an article and get it out the door, they'll use, I mean, if it's good, there should be a link to the press release that they got their information from. If there's no link saying, here's where I got this, like, don't even bother reading that. You have to have a source to say, like, where did this come from? And so, yeah, I mean, that's for me. It's like I might use a headline to go, huh, really? And then I'm going to go read it somewhere else. I'm not going to bother reading the article.
All right, last question, then I'll let you go. If you see a headline in, say the New York Times or, an article or periodical that you respect, whatever that may be.
It wouldn't be the Times. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was about. That's why I was like, I'll let you say. So what I find that a lot of times the best non-biased information comes from the people who are the least popular and not well funded and don't market and things like that. So I guess when you read an article from one of these larger, more public facing things, Fox News, CNN, CBS, one of these, basically the larger they are, and you see one of these headlines, do you have a couple of sources or websites that you go to that you recommend?
That's a good question. I mean, like I said, I tend to find wherever the thing came from, right? So new study from University of Cambridge says blank. And I'll just go to that department at University of Cambridge and like read. Like
we get it. You're from the UK. You spend time over there. Just, I'll go over. Just go, hey, John, good to see you again. Tell me about that study.
They like that study. No, but you go to the website and you'll find the press release. So like that's where I'll start my source verification. And then the second is that I actually look to see if it's shown up in a different study. So like, let's say New York Times says this thing happened, then it's like, okay, they should cite where that study came from, and I'll look at that study, and then I'll look for a second study. And now I'm probably not a great person to ask, like, where do you go? Because I'll oftentimes just go to Google Scholar, and I'll say, like, what other literature exists on this? Which the average person is not going to want to do, because then you have to figure out how to translate all these, like, scientists who do not know how to write in, like, human language. So Scientific American I've oftentimes liked. They do a lot of really cool breakdown of information. The BBC, actually, I know you're going to get mad at me for being British, but they do a good job. So I like them. The New York Times used to have a science section, which I did go to, and they got rid of the science section 15 years ago. I'm going to really date myself. So I haven't found like one news source that I really trust on that.
Yeah, and that's part of what makes it that much harder. No, I appreciate your honest answer, right? I mean, it's not really the easiest thing to do, right? And so that's why I think the main thing I encourage everyone to do is, even if you're not going to take that next step and dive deeper, just don't believe everything at the surface level, right? Like, and if you hear, and honestly, the spot it worries me most is when I'm in a group of people, my friends, family, whatever, and I hear somebody say, "Oh, ABC," like that's the thing. And again, also like the more strong language, I'm like, whoa. And I'll actually take a second and be like, hey, did you follow that? Like, where did that come from? And I'll start to ask some of those questions, and I'll say, just to introduce a little bit of that doubt, if you will, because, one of the previous times you were on here, you told us about a story where you had a very smart friend who came up to you and said, hey, did you hear that broccoli has more protein than steak or something like that? And then you're like, but you're a scientist. Have you like thought that through and really, looked into it? And she's like,
how could that be?
Oh, okay, no. So yeah, I think one thing is,
I think you just raised your eyebrow at her, right? She just went, and she was like, oh yeah, that's not true.
Yeah, yeah, the doubt eyebrow.
I agree. Well, and this is what I was saying about science being a crowd endeavor, right? Like the wisdom of the crowds. What happens is you'll have 15 media outlets pick up the same single study, and so it looks like there's all these people saying it. Right? But it's actually the same single piece of data or, single scientific finding that's just being like echoed around. And so that's the thing that I'll also say is like, okay, yes, CNN said this and NBC said this and whatever, but if they're all pointed back to this one place, that isn't a robust finding. It's not you haven't gotten that like repeatability in that body of evidence yet. But if you find that like the NIH does a study on it, and then at whatever the CDC does another study on it, and then this group does a study on it, and all of them have come to the same conclusion, then you can start to feel a little bit more confident. So that's the other thing to also check, is to be like, how many different groups have actually found this thing, not just different news outlets.
And we mentioned the source of funding and things like that, but one thing I don't know we explicitly said, which is who stands to gain from these findings. That's an important thing to keep in mind. So, well, thank you so much for coming on today, Alexandra. It has been a wonder, as it always has. Thank you for keeping us in check. Writer, go write the errata for all the times we did all the things wrong. Go do that one for us. Well, have a great day, and we'll talk with you later.
Take care.
All right.
Great. Now I don't trust anything ever.
I know. I don't even trust myself.
And
I'm a smart guy.
Really,
as you heard that guy say.
You are a smart guy, and you should doubt everything all the time.
Perfect. Thank you guys. Have a wonderful day.
That's the lesson for your life right here. We finally figured it out.
We have officially figured it out. Well, we are going to take a quick 30 seconds here to, just refresh our coffee and digest what that really means and how we can maybe apply that to our lives. So we encourage you guys to do the same. The beauty of having a couple of seconds to think is it gives you time to reflect. So we'll take that time right now and reflect. Welcome back.
That was so peaceful.
Yes. As the world is on fire. There's a 60% chance we're all going to have a great time.
I know, right? Or, while the world is burning down, you're like, well, thank goodness for YouTube or Spotify streaming music, right? Chill ambient sounds.
Yeah, there's something to be said about, not that was negative, right? I think that was very much like, okay, this is a good to know, good for us to take this information and apply it so we can be kind of smarter about the things we're consuming.
I think it was great because we get to sort of see that science is doing wonderfully. What we really talked about most of the time, though, was journalism. Mm-hmm. And that's the difference is I don't think, the other part of it is she's talking about having an educated populace who's willing to track things down. And we've talked previously about attention spans and how we direct our focus and our energy. And we have all these other things we'd rather be doing, such as consuming media rather than going to the source of material. So, what we're really kind of finding there is that, you were talking about following the money. And she was talking about one publication turning into 15 basically it's picked up by the Newswire and spread out to 15 different major industry leaders or news sources. And all of a sudden it's like we're talking about following the money again, and we're talking about journalism here. And it's something else that is also a guy named Timothy Snyder who wrote The Road to Unfreedom, which is maps out how, especially over in Europe and Russia, how they have turned into more parts of it have turned into tyrannical or fascist or totalitarian states. Is some of the things that he talks about is when journalism is no longer believed.
Yeah, and that's tough, right? And obviously, we're in the fake news era, right? And so it's like, oh, okay, what does that even mean? But how do you trust anybody? All those types of things, right? But it's worth pointing out that, again, like Alexandra was saying, like science is better than other approaches, and it's methodical. One thing we didn't say in there, but is we kind of alluded to, is it's peer reviewed, right? So even before a study gets published, you have a group of peers who review the thing and like, hey, this is wrong, you need to shift this, and I actually had a friend who is working on a paper for their graduate studies, and I was like, hey, how's that paper going? And because they finished writing it like months ago, and it's like, we're going to publish soon. And it's like, dang, she's like, yeah, we've got to do a lot of revisions. And, they realized your scope was too big. So we need to narrow down to this thing. And then we wrote some more, and then we had to send it off for edits, and it gets a process. And, that process sucks when you're in it, because you're like, I want the paper to be done. But that process, the reason things are slow is to allow time and other eyes and things like that. Another example I can think of is with the government. People like to complain so much about how the government is slow. Well, the government is slow for a reason, to allow some checks and balances and allow that process to happen, right? And so that's another thing that popped into my head. So I'm it's always good to have her on. I feel like she does a great job. Yeah. So talking about the news information and things like that. Let's go to more of a, I guess, entertainment type of consumption, right? When you're consuming entertainment, I guess the first question is, have you noticed that different types of entertainment makes you feel or think different ways?
Yeah, definitely. We might have touched on this before, but I get really wrapped up in fiction. I really bond with the characters, and so on occasion, if I find myself being too emotional, I will go to a non-fictional book or something else. I'll go to listen to podcasts, or I'll do something like that to sort of walk me off of this sort of emotional cliff that I can find myself in. And then, but what is also interesting is living in that realm of all this kind of nonfiction and like trying to consume tons and tons of sort of data and information and sift through it, is that turns into a different part of me, and I become something around that. Like I become a data consumption, like a vampire omnivore, just sucking up facts like a vacuum cleaner, maybe.
So today you said that you're a leech,
and
a vampire
and a vacuum,
and a vacuum, and you really suck.
I totally suck.
This just out. 50% of studies say that writer sucks.
Yeah, and he's a blowhard too.
Yes, thank you. I was like, all right, what are some more? Oh man, masticate. Does that mean suck as well?
No, that is chew. But I do like to chew on things as well.
There's some other fancy words for suck. We'll have to keep that one going. But yeah, I've noticed that as well. Like nonfiction, fiction, that's one type of thing. But even that's like saying like, oh, section A versus section B, when in reality there's so many different genres and subgenres within those things, and they all, whether you like to think it or not, are manipulating your feelings and your thoughts. And fiction is intentionally doing that. That is one of the points of fiction, is to try and get your readers or your viewers to feel something, right? And some of that's good, some of that's bad. And I think Danielle said before on the show, is like, oh, okay, well, after we watch like kind of like a darker show, like we really like the show Ozark. I've always forget if there's an S in the end. But it's frankly just a dark show, and some stressful things happen, and you're like uneasy, you have unrest about what may happen next, and then you feel bad for the characters and all that kind of stuff. And it's like, we watched that like one time, like right before bed, and I was like, well, I don't want to do that again. I want to have a little buffer, at least some time, or
some
maybe
adventure time.
Right. Yeah. Adventure time would be a great one, but something, silly and lighthearted, and then, Danielle's got these things. She's like, oh, whenever I've felt like that, she's like, I watch Sweet Home Alabama, I watch Friends, and she watches her Disney movies. She has like her cleanse, if you will. She's like, I like Ozark, but then I have my transition thing because the other thing too is it's not just right after, but that can leak into the rest of your day.
Oh yeah, I think whatever. I mean, we've talked about input outputs, and whatever is going in, it's rattling around in there in your subconscious somewhere. And yeah, I was so the last couple days, I felt like I've been in a pretty good mood. And while we were going out for Thanksgiving, then I had downloaded some audiobooks that were just kind of fun. They're just kind of fluff and candy. That's kind of the way I consider them. But they're entertaining for the drive, and then coming back home, of course, I haven't finished one of them, so I was still listening to it. And these, one of them is called the Murderbot Diaries, which is really, for me, quite funny. It's
I mean, just the title,
the
the
title.
Murderbot Diaries.
Yeah.
Like, that's gonna be entertaining,
Good.
right?
It's good. Yeah, the lady Martha Wells, and I'm on like book 6. These are short little books, and they're, but it's basically a robot that kind of hacks the governor module, so he doesn't get his brain erased anymore. But he's basically like a security unit robot, but he kind of falls in love with consuming soap operas. And so that's like the premise.
Nice.
And then yet finds himself in all these weird situations, and it's really funny because humans are gross and they're like leaking and they touch everything, and so it's good. And then I've been listening to another one that's like Eric Ugland, and it's called a lit RPG, but it's basically one of these books where the initial premise is that the character gets put into a video game. And then within the video game, you have stat sheets and you have all this stuff, and you go adventuring. And so it's like his character in a fantasy land. And of course, he's just like a total bro. And he just goes around being like, dude, whatever, your mom, and stuff like that. And these people are talking in haughty accents to him. And so those are a lot of fun too. I think that's called the Hero series or something. And I found that yesterday I was just walking along smiling, and I was like, what is different from today from like 2 weeks ago?
Right.
And I was like, oh, I'm listening to funny audiobooks.
I mean, it certainly helps, and it can make a really big difference. And it brought up, actually reminded me of an anonymous comment we got the other day. And it said, I'm driving to work right now, and for some reason vibing, even though I've been up since 6 o'clock. I've been noticing how awesome the clouds look and how the planes look really pretty with the sky. And then it hit me, maybe had to do something with seeing the sunrise this morning. And so, it reminded me of our challenge that we had a few weeks back, which was, hey, go look and see the sunrise or the sunset. And it's like, it may sound silly, but doing something like that and intentionally taking the time to, consume that. In that case, your entertainment is nature, right?
Right.
But taking that moment to do that, it then frames like how you're seeing the rest of the world, right? And if there's anything we've learned over the last couple of days is what you do and what you listen to, what you read, what you see, that affects the lens that you see the world through, and that could be for the better or it could be for the worse. And one of the key things that is a great skill to develop is self-awareness and being aware, like, hey, I'm doing really good right now. So what are the things that help me do really good right now so I can replicate those?
Yeah.
Or the flip side, of course, I'm doing pretty bad right now.
Right.
And what are the things that led me here? And oh, by the way, I've got these things of good things that I've recognized that are good for me. Well, I'm going to do more of those, right? And we actually will have a series coming out in a little bit where I talk about the things that make my life rich, the things that make my life good, because I actually did this exercise a little while back, and it was awesome, and it was like, all right, anytime you feel like your life isn't good, like, go look at this list, and then also maybe go do some of those things that you say bring so much joy and stuff into your life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my wife teaches art at a college, and one of the things she does to help inspire her students is they have to originally come up with a list of their 20 favorite things. And then every time you're stumped and you're like, I don't know what I'm going to do, I don't know what to draw, I don't know what to make, then you just reference that list.
Yeah.
And if these are your favorite things, then like, just let's jump into them, like double down on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. So, I wanted to give a couple of examples of, things that I would recommend consuming, right? So, especially if you are looking to be in a good mood or you just find yourself in a funk or something like that, I think one of the words that comes to mind is wholesome. Some sort of book or show or podcast or whatever that just kind of like you can't help but like feel good, even if it's maybe a little cheesy or a little too sweet for you or whatever, it's still going to make you feel good. And a couple of shows that come to mind for that are Schitt's Creek, and Ted Lasso.
Yeah, those are both great.
Yeah. And then, of course, there's a couple of popular sitcoms and things like that. I also like Modern Family. Then that's another fun one where it's just like you watch these things and you're just like, you just leave in a better mood, and it's like this is good. And sometimes you need that, and sometimes like like my wife Danielle does, you could use that as a cleanse after you've done the consumption of the other thing that you like, but may not put you in as good of a mood. And then on the podcast side of things, it's funny because it was, I don't know, a month or two ago where I found myself like, okay, I've got all these nonfiction podcasts on here. I had one, hashtag nerd alert, Dungeons and Dragons podcast that I listened to. But that's the only like fiction podcast I had consumed. And I was like, well, it's nice because I find myself like, all right, if I just need to kind of like, just not necessarily zone out, but as the nature of my job and also the nature of who I am, I'm always analyzing everything and trying to figure out the best way to do this and the best thing about that, and then learning, and it's like, all right, sometimes I just need to like kind of take a break, and it's nice to have. That's where fiction comes in really good for me a lot of times, and so listening to that Dungeons and Dragon podcast is like a good way because it's just a couple of guys having a funny time, and it's actually not as nerdy as you would think because these guys are just comedians and they're telling the story, and you get to know these characters and things like that. It's cool because a lot of people look at role-playing games and they think of someone in their basement and hyper nerd and all these type of things, but at the end of the day, what a role-playing game is it's a group of people who are writing a story together, and they each create these characters that they have just like a character in a book, and they give them these traits that they want to have, which, oh, by the way, like part of playing a role-playing game can be another way for you to escape. And it's like, all right, and sometimes people will choose traits and things that they are very opposite from what they have, right? Like normally I'm the shy, meek one, but in this game, like I am the warrior who charges in, and I am the one who has no fear, and I say all these brash jokes that I never would say in real life, and it's like an excuse.
You sort of embody that new character, and you try it on, and that's kind of fun.
Yeah, and so it wasn't the point of what I was saying, but try out some role playing games. Take off that lens of judgment and think like, hey, maybe that could be something fun to try out. But if you're also like, oh, why would I do that? The podcast that I'm listening to is called The Adventure Zone, and again, it's a group of it's a family, which also makes it fun because it's 3 brothers and their dad, and they have all sorts of jokes the whole time, and even if you don't really get into the whole fantasy world or things like that, it's still fun to hear about. And I learned about role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons in one context with a group of friends, and I had a certain like lens and judgment on it, and then I listened to this podcast and I was like, oh wow, this can be something completely different, right? Because it was way different from my regular exposure. And they were like, a lot of times they just like throw the rules out of the thing. It's like, oh, we don't really care as much about the rules. We're about entertaining you guys, helping you get into the characters, have a good time, and things like that. And on top of all that, when you have these things, you have a community that's built around it where people are talking about it online. They'll go watch live shows and stuff like that. So there's something to be said too about, as you consume some of these things, getting involved with, if you want to take it even further, and then you get even more into it, right? And it can have even more outsized benefits.
Yeah, there's. And this is kind of one of the
spilling coffee.
We were talking about being skeptical of certain things, and we're talking about replacing them. We're talking about consumption. Where there's all these kind of topics that we're kind of covering, and it's also sort of interesting to see how far down the rabbit hole you can go before you sort of lose moderation or you lose scope and focus. But if you haven't done that in a while, sometimes it's like just give yourself permission.
Right.
Like go down that rabbit hole, just, especially if it's making you feel good and it's not hurting anyone else around you, or maybe you're involving more people and you're finding a new friend network. One of the people that we interviewed yesterday was actually talking about dance and joining in with these kind of communities as a way to really heal yourself and the way to find friends, a way to find partners. And I was just like, oh, this is great, right? There's all these gateways and pathways out there for that can be just super beneficial, but of course if you don't try them out, you'll never know.
Right. And I'm glad you brought that up. And to clarify for those at home, this was not on our episode from yesterday. This is an interview we did yesterday that we'll be publishing later on. So look for the name Chenarut as we published that, because that was the name of the guy we interviewed. And he was saying basically the same kind of thing, but about dance. Is like, well, people see dance and they think it needs to be done this way or done that way. And then as soon as they realize, like, you don't have to do it that way, and let me show you this other way. And oh, well, by the way, with dance, it's like, don't care what other people think, dance like no one is watching, then, it's like, oh, it can completely change everything. So I guess consume like nobody is watching, like, and don't have any shame. Like, hey, if you like the really cheesy, romance books with the shirtless man on front, and sometimes he's wearing a cowboy hat, sometimes he's got guns, and other times he's just
swashbuckler.
Yeah, and he's always like lightly sweaty for some reason.
He's been slightly misted.
Yeah, if that's your jam, go for it. Don't have any shame. If your jam is Hallmark movies, where the guy comes from the big city and he meets the small town girl, and they go to kiss the first time, but then the kiss doesn't happen, and then they they eventually find out that, oh, we were meant for each other after all. Even if it is like, oh, totally predictable and same kind of plot line applied a whole bunch of different ways, that's okay. It doesn't really matter. That's your jam.
Yeah, I'm kind of, we should jump into this in another episode. I'm really interested in this idea that maybe when your jam becomes so much of a jam that you're actually turning other people off. Like, that would be the opposite, right? When it's like, I'm sorry, but I only talk about this one thing.
Right.
Like, my personality has become one-dimensional. Like, most of us don't have that problem, though. Most of us, if anything, are so scattered and fragmented just trying to make it through the day that we don't have that sort of one thing that's bringing us joy all the time. So if you can find that, do it.
Well, Ryder, just the other day we were saying stop consuming, don't ever do any consuming. Now you're saying not only just consume, but it's okay to binge sometimes. But where's the answer, Ryder? You're saying both sides of the argument.
Well,
here.
you know what? Write in to the show and tell me everything you're doing, and then I will come up with a middle point for you.
Yeah, no, and then I jest, but that's how it works, right? That's how it works on a lot of these things, right? Whether it's something of the mind, whether it's consuming, whether it's having fun, whatever it is, everything is good in moderation, and the true answer probably lies in the middle somewhere, right?
Yeah. I think that's sort of the goal on all these things and I think you don't find it though unless you're aware. And so we've been sort of trying to talk about keeping your mind open, paying attention to what's going on around you, going back to statistics, just taking it all with a little bit of a grain of salt.
Yeah. So do you have any challenge that pops into your head for today, or would you like me to take that one?
Yeah, you take it.
Okay. Yeah. So I think, the main challenge I'll have for you guys is pick one little headline or tidbit that you've heard, or something that somebody has, told you, or maybe you see it today while you're scrolling through your social media. Well, first off, go and actually read past the headline. That's one thing. And then maybe look into it a little bit and then talk with some people about it. That last one is the most important, and tell them hey, guilty as charged. I've been pretty bad about, maybe I'm even the person who shares these things all the time, and maybe they all say a certain thing, and maybe there's some agenda that I have, or maybe I don't even realize any of these things, but hey, I read something today, or I saw a headline. Well, you go a little deeper, look in a little bit deeper, and go to a different news source. If there was a study mentioned, go look up that study and read a couple things about it. As Alexander was alluding to it, you can go down that rabbit hole, and it can get real scientific and things like that, somewhat quickly. But there's value in doing it at least a little bit, to go and see, because maybe you Google the study and you're then you start seeing oh, debunked, or not replicated, or this or that, right? And then it's okay, well, now I know, and now I can share those things. So that's kind of the challenge. Any modifications or additions to that?
No, I think what's fascinating about it is you might even go to an article that you already have shared several times.
Yeah.
And go dig into that. It doesn't have to necessarily be something new. It could be interesting for you to see if what you've been sharing, because of course I was just referencing Daniel Kahneman's book about the judges. So this came out of a text that I read, and I've been throwing that around everywhere. And then Alexander just sweep of the hand.
Yep.
And I'm oops.
So definitely going to go read a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no,
right?
now I need to go read about this. Now I need to. So that was kind of going to be my takeaway today, was that I need to go read about something that I have been saying repeatedly. And it's obviously wrong now.
Yeah,
or maybe it's not. I don't know.
And that's part of science too, right? And that's part of journalism. All these types of things is all right, stuff comes out, and then after the fact, more facts come to the light. And the other thing too, that's one of the downsides of journalism, I want to say especially these days, but I don't know if that's true, is, people want to have that headline out early, right? They want to have this thing. They want to be the first to the press. They want to do this. And so they'll release the partial information, which doesn't paint the full picture, right? And so, it might actually be more value in going and looking at something that you read or posted or talked about or remembered hearing from a little bit ago, right? And that could be, a week ago, a couple weeks, couple months, could be a couple years ago. But yeah, so think, is there something that pops to your mind? If so, go check that out. If not, keep that in your mind today as you're going throughout the world. And it's not, it doesn't go a day or maybe a couple days where I don't hear somebody saying something they read or they saw or they heard somewhere, or of course, just seeing as I'm scrolling through, the internet, and it's like, just go a little bit deeper, think about some of the things that we were talking about today, and figure like, hey, let me get a little bit more to the truth, and then tell some people about it. Tell some people about the things you learned here today. Enlighten people on that, that new thing that you're learning. And yeah, keep going with that one. So with that, we will take you to our lovely post-show music. And everybody, you have a wonderful hump day. Whether it's one or two.
Wonderful Camel Day, everybody.
Yes.
Go have fun.